Welcome back to the final session of our series, The Glories of the Gospel. We had so much content in last session, I broke it into two parts. So we've just finished talking about how Jesus has come as the great action hero, defeating all the D's, death and destruction and disease and demons, as he takes back this world for his Father. Now we're going to move from that focus to the center core of this gospel, the focus on the way of Jesus, how to follow the way of the cross. So there's a movement of the narrative then with those themes in mind that's ultimately directed to Jerusalem and the cross. The cross is the way to follow Jesus. In fact, that's seen in the sophisticated structure of this book. The book has what's called a chiastic structure. It's what some call an inverted parallelism. Themes or geographic locations in the opening chapters are then paralleled or mirrored in the closing chapters. And then there's always an important central theme that's being emphasized in a book that's at the center of this chiastic shape. You can see it there on the screen. There are no infancy narratives in Mark. We begin with John the Baptist, and then Jesus immediately is in the place of death. That's the first opening theme, the wilderness. Then Jesus' words and works in the Galilee are described. And then Jesus describes at the center of this gospel the way of discipleship, a life-giving way that might include persecution, family rejection, suffering, even martyrdom. And then after that central core theme, we have another geographic reference that acts as a kind of mirror to the Galilee in the beginning. This time it's focused on his words and works in Jerusalem. And finally, the gospel ends with a parallel to the wilderness. It ends in a place of death with scenes from the tomb of Jesus. Now, by the way, that theme of the way is in the opening chapter of Mark's gospel. It's the opening salvo, you might say. A voice cries in the wilderness. What does it cry? Prepare the way of the Lord. So why is the central theme of suffering and carrying one's cross in order to follow Jesus on the way so strongly emphasized in Mark's gospel? Well, remember that original audience. They're facing severe persecution. So the refrain of Jesus in that center section is do not fear, but only have faith. Though this faith in Jesus isn't always going to lead to martyrdom, the way of Jesus will always involve death. It's always a dying of some kind. For us, in a world where we're not martyred, it's a dying to old ways of thinking and acting and embracing a new king and kingdom that brings freedom, joy, and restoration. A restoration of what it means to be fully human. In a word, the good news. Now, Mark's gospel ends strangely as well. He's going to leave us with that choice of following Jesus on the way that's left kind of hanging in the air. Will I believe and remain faithful, or will I be fearful and run from persecution and death? You see, the oldest and most reliable manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark end with the women finding the tomb empty and being afraid. There was no record of the appearances of the risen Jesus in our oldest copies. In fact, it ends so awkwardly in the Greek, it's right in the middle of a sentence. Now, why does Mark do this? Certainly his audience would have known that Jesus had risen from the dead. They would have known those resurrection stories and that Peter was himself an eyewitness to the resurrection. What is his motivation by ending his gospel with the women afraid and running from the tomb? Well, my friend Dr. Mary Healy reflects on this so beautifully in her commentary on Mark that I want to end with her words. She says, "Was the last page lost from the original manuscript, or did Mark perhaps have to suddenly escape to avoid martyrdom before he was able to complete his work? But when read in the light of his overall narrative purpose, the ending is not so surprising. Indeed, it is purposeful. Throughout his work, Mark has portrayed misunderstanding, fear, failure, and flight on the part of Jesus' chosen disciples. He's depicted the shortcomings of even the leaders of the early church, Peter, with relentless candor. He's brought us on a journey of discipleship as we too are confronted with Jesus' startling words, astonishing claims, awesome deeds, and divine logic that overturns all human ways of thinking. And so now with this last verse, Mark has finally brought us right to the center of the story. We too are now face to face with the announcement of Jesus' victory over death. But how are we going to respond? Mark writes knowing that his original readers are well aware of how the story continues. Peter and the disciples did see the risen Lord, and their encounter with him becomes the bedrock of the apostolic proclamation of the gospel that will resound throughout the Roman Empire. The very existence of the early Christian community for whom the gospel is written is testimony to the fulfillment of Jesus' promises. Now, every reader is invited to accept in faith the testimony of his resurrection. The story is not concluded because it continues in the life of every disciple of Jesus for all time. Isn't that beautiful? So that strange ending was not so strange after all. It was very intentional by Mark. It's been such a joy for me to explore this gospel with you. And it's so exciting to consider in this liturgical year that in the Sunday readings and the daily readings, we're going to be going verse by verse by verse through this Gospel of Mark. I hope this has laid a foundation for you to really go deeper, to enter into this text, and by entering the text, to meet Jesus anew.